Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is part one of the Vogue V9075 sew along. Today we're going to be looking at preparing your pattern, choosing fabrics, making any alterations that you need to suit your figure, and looking at things such as pattern placement and cutting out the fabric. So let's get started. Okay, so what you're going to need to make the Vogue V9075 is firstly your pattern. Okay, now the patterns obviously come in two different sizes. I've got size ranges, should I say. So I've got the smaller size range, which is the 6 to size 14. What I tend to do, now on Vogue patterns, it gives you the body measurement sizes of the pattern. Now on the actual pattern pieces itself, which you'll see shortly, it does give you the finished measurements, and that's generally what I go by. So yeah, so you're going to need your pattern, you're going to need some fabric. Now the fabric I've chosen is this gorgeous cotton lawn that I purchased from Sew Me Sunshine. On the back of the pattern it gives you, I'm looking in metres because we purchase in metres in the UK, and it tells me that for option B, which is the jumpsuit, I need, for my size, roughly, this is 150 centimetres wide fabric, so I'm going to need 2.5 metres roughly. When I made this before, that was the amount that I needed to get through it. So you've got your pattern, you've got your fabric, you're going to need pins, fabric marker. You can use chalk, tailor's tacks. I like these friction pens. I don't know if you've seen these before. They sell these on Amazon. You can also get them from Tesco's, and they're not actually designed for fabric, but they basically come off in heat, so you can mark on fabric, but I would advise you do it on a test piece first. You can use it to get a fine line on fabric and then iron over it and it will come off. So yeah, so I use that, a tape measure and a French curve or pattern master. Before you start hacking away at your tissue pattern, if you take out the instruction guide for your pattern and have a look at obviously which option that you're making. So we're going to be making the jumpsuit, which is B, and this version I'm going to do the sleeved version as well. Obviously I did the sleeveless last time. Now it tells you which pieces you need, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 9 and 10, and it gives you options of pattern layouts on your fabric. Now I don't always follow these, sometimes it's dependent on obviously whether you've got a directional print on your fabric. This fabric that I've chosen doesn't have that, so I don't think that's going to be so much of an issue. But sometimes, obviously, if you don't have a directional print, you can play about with your pattern pieces on your fabric to try and make the most economical use of your fabric. The other thing that you do have to bear in mind, though, is making sure that your grain lines are parallel to the selvage, which we'll talk about in a little while. So you can either trace your pattern pieces, or you can just cut them out of the tissue. I do a bit of a combination. For me, my body size does sometimes change. I am known to put weight on and lose weight as well, but where that tends to affect me more is in my upper body. My lower body doesn't tend to change much. Now with this pattern, because we're looking at obviously a wide leg bottom, what I've actually done is I've just cut the trousers straight out of the tissue, because I know that no matter whether I gain a few pounds or not, it's actually going to still fit me. But the bodice sizes I have traced off because I knew that there would be a bit of tinkering with that. So What you will need to do is trace off your pattern pieces or cut them out of the tissue, whichever method you prefer, and then make any adjustments that you need to make. Now, obviously, if you've not made this pattern before and it is a princess seamed bodice, which means that you've got lots of seam lines to be able to make any adjustments on it. I would recommend, obviously, that if you've never made this pattern before and you do have some uniqueness to your body, whether that's that you don't fit into standard sizes like most of us don't, then I would recommend that you do a 12 first. I didn't, I just went straight ahead and hoped for the best, I guess. So the adjustments that I've needed to make, I've cut, these are the trouser pieces here, and I always have to lower the crotch depth. Now there's two methods to doing this. What you can do is measure yourself from just probably about an inch above your belly button. This is sort of a high-waisted jumpsuit, so it sits on your natural waist, which is generally an inch above your belly button, and then you can measure from that point, obviously between your legs, up through the back to the other side, and that measurement then you would need to measure the distance from the inner crotch here up to the top, and again on the front, which is obviously from there right round to there, and then deduct off the seam allowance from that measurement. Then you can, on this pattern it does have lengthen and shorten lines, so for me I've needed to add in that extra crotch depth because I'm quite tall. I added in an inch on the front and an inch on the back piece at this point here. Now when I made this pattern up in the version that you saw in my other video a couple of months back, it did still feel a little bit tight, especially when I sort of stretched. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add in an extra ½ inch on each piece, so that to just give me a little bit more wiggle room down here, shall we say. So that's the two pattern pieces for the jumpsuit bottom. And then for the bodice pieces, you've got two pieces for the back. You've got the main back pieces and the side back. I've done that the wrong way around, haven't I? No, yeah, that's right. This is the side back, that's the back. And then you've got the front piece, the front two pieces. So you've got the bodice front and then the side front. So this is what gives you the princess seams. Now, you need to make sure that you trace off the size that you are starting with and put in all the notches, the grain lines, if you are tracing off, and the lengthen and shorten lines. Now again, I always have to make a 1 inch adjustment for me because I'm tall and I'm long bodied and long legged. So I add in an inch to the bodice here so that it actually sits on my natural waist rather than it being a bit too high and cutting into my ribs. And I've also traced off the sleeve portion as well and added in the markings on here. So you have 2 notches at the back, which is usually standard on most patterns. 1 notch signals the front of the arm, and then you've got 3 little dots. This is where you're going to put the gathering stitches to gather the sleeve head to fit it into the bodice. And then the pocket piece, obviously you don't have to put pockets in if you don't want them. I sometimes do, sometimes don't, just depends on what I'm making. I do actually quite like the pockets in this jumpsuit. So that's all the pieces traced off, cut out, and next we're going to get them onto our fabric. Now the only other adjustment that I wanted to make was, on this version, was to the bodice front. If you remember on the other version that I did, I found that the front neckline was just a little bit too high for me. So how this works is, this is obviously the front bodice, which will fit into the side bodice like that when we sew it up in the fabric. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to just lower this neckline by about ½ inch. So how you do that is, basically I'm just going to use my tape measure to mark off ½ inch, and then I'm going to use my French curve to basically just true that up. So essentially, if I can just do this and show you. So it's essentially going to just curve round It's essentially just going to curve around like that to make sure that I've dropped that front neckline. Because this is a lined bodice, I don't need to worry about altering a facing to match or anything like that. But obviously if you're making this with a facing rather than fully lined, then you would need to make those same adjustments to your facing piece as well so that it matches. Just to show you, I've made that adjustment there. So I've dropped the front neckline by about ½ inch, and I have just used my French curve just to redraw that front neckline to give it a nice curve, and I've added in the notch onto my new neckline, so I'm going to cut that piece off now. The options that it gives you for fabric choices are here. So it suggests lightweight denim, crepe, jerseys, linen blends. You want something that is going to have a little bit of drape to it. So where it suggests linen, I wouldn't choose a full linen, because most linens tend to be quite stiff, and what will happen is the trouser portion, or if the skirt, if you're making that version, won't hang nicely and drape. So you want something quite drapey. If you're a beginner, I would suggest that you go with a lightweight cotton, that kind of fabric. I've chosen, for this version, I've chosen obviously this fabric that I mentioned, which is a cotton lawn. So this is quite a lightweight cotton, and I've chosen this one because I love it, and also because sewing this up for the tutorial I think is going to help you to see what's going on. The fabric that I chose for the other version that you saw in my other video was like a georgette fabric that's very, very drapey and a little bit more difficult to handle. So dependent on your skills and your experience in sewing, I would suggest that if you're a beginner, you go for something like this, which is a cotton lawn, which is still going to give you a nice drapey effect, but be easier for you to handle. Or if you're more adventurous, you can go for something like a viscose or even a satin, that kind of fabric. So yeah, so you don't want something too stiff, you want something with a little bit of drape, yeah, something that you like. So if you look at the pattern pieces on the tissue paper inside, this is where it tells you the finished garment measurements. So my high bust is, my full bust measurement is around 36 inches. So this is where I went with the size 10 to 12 because I like my bodices quite fitted, because I tend to have quite a small high bust and tend to have a lot of gaping. So I tend to err on the side of a little bit smaller. But this is down to personal preference. If you look on the pattern envelope, the body measurements, it tells you for a size 12 bust is 34, and obviously the finished measurement is 36.5, so you've got 2.5 inches of ease there. So that's obviously your preference. On the pants part, it gives you the full hip finished measurements as well, and obviously these are quite wide because it's wide leg, so you've got plenty of room to play with there. Okay, so I've now pinned out my pattern pieces. So this is my fold here, and the selvages are just along that side there. So I've got 2.5 meters of this fabric. Now, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if your fabric has a one-way directional print, you will need to make sure that all your pattern pieces all face the same direction. So I don't think this does have a directional print, but I have tried to put on, I'm sorry for the sunlight there, I'm trying to make sure that all my pieces do follow the same direction, just in case. Now, I haven't tried or bothered with any pattern matching with this particular fabric, but if your fabric does have, say, a geometric print, or you've got some sort of fabric that you think you do need to pattern match, then the easiest way for you to do that is to look at to match where the crotch line is on the trousers. So I would ensure that the top of the crotch on both the front and the back piece for your trouser pieces are both on the same part of your fabric where you want to pattern match. And the same with your bodice pieces. I would be looking at the underarm seam as your pattern matching point, if that makes sense. Now, in addition to that, what you also have to be aware of, dependent on what fabric you have and the design or the print of it, is print placement on your fabric. Now, this is the side front bodice piece here. Now, this curve bit here is the bit that's going to go over the apex of your bust point and down to your waist, okay? So what I would be considering, dependent on the fabric that you've got, is whether, if you've got something that's got a big flower print, for instance, you're not going to want this piece put over some fabric where there's a huge flower, because that's going to highlight your apex of your bust. If you want that kind of look, then obviously go ahead. I personally wouldn't. So you do need to consider the fabric that you're using, where you're putting your pattern pieces on the fabric, so that you're not going to highlight particular areas of your body. The same with the crotch of your trousers. Again, if you've got something with a really busy print, or really sort of a plain background but with big flowers or something on, you're not going to want a big flower over your crotch. I wouldn't. You might, but I wouldn't. So just really consider those kinds of things when you're putting your pieces on your fabric. And it's those kinds of considerations which will mean that you might need a little bit more fabric. Obviously the bodice part of this jumpsuit is fully lined. My other jumpsuit that I made, I lined it with cotton lawn, so I didn't have enough of my fashion fabric to be able to fully line it in the fashion fabric. So if that is something else you can think about, if you've got a really expensive fashion fabric and you think, I just can't afford to purchase enough to fully line it in the fashion fabric, you can choose a cheaper fabric to line it in, but just again try and use something that's almost a similar weight to the fashion fabric, and make sure that the colour of it is going to sort of contrast with it or blend with it. You don't want, for instance, a light fashion fabric like I've got here and then use a dark lining, because it's going to alter the colour of the fashion fabric and it's possibly going to show through. So there's those kinds of things that you have to consider as well. I've got enough fabric left here to, this is what I've got left at the bottom. So if I just pan back a bit, you'll be able to see. So I've got probably just over ½ metre left at the bottom, and so I've got enough there to cut out the other 4 pieces of my bodice out of this fabric, so that I can line it in the fashion fabric as well. The pocket piece, which is just up here, I need 4 pieces of this, so I'm hoping that I will have enough to get another two pocket pieces out of the bottom of this fabric, what I've got left. But it's more important for me to make sure I've got enough for the 4 bodice pieces. So when I've cut these pieces out, I'm going to obviously cut an extra piece for the lining for the 4 bodice pieces. If I don't have enough left to get the extra 2 pocket pieces out of that, then I'll just use some plain white cotton lawn that I've got in my stash for the pocket facings. So when you're happy with the placement of all your pattern pieces, you've obviously considered the pattern placement, any pattern matching that you want to do. You want to make sure that all your grain lines, as I mentioned earlier, are parallel to the selvage. So if you traced out your patterns, you should have traced out your grain lines, and obviously the selvage edges are here, so they should be parallel to that. The grain line on this pattern piece is, I don't know if you can see that, it's about there. So I've made sure that that is parallel to that edge up there. So when you're happy that you've got everything on your fabric where it should be, and then you can go ahead and cut out your pieces. This is where you have to get a little bit imaginative with the amount of fabric that you have left. If you remember, this is the piece of fabric that I had left over to get the lining of my bodice pieces and the extra 2 pocket pieces out of. So I have my bodice front on the fold of the fabric, because I need to cut one on the fold there. I've got the bodice side front there, and I've got the bodice back side piece there, which is just up to the selvage. And then I've had to be able to get all these pieces on this piece of fabric that I've got left, I've actually got the bodice back piece upside down on the fabric here. Now I'm not too worried about this, because obviously this is going to be in the lining, so it doesn't matter if there is a directional print in the lining, because obviously you're not going to see it, it's going to be in the inside of your garment. So to fit these pieces on this piece of fabric that I had left, I have had to put that piece upside down, and then I've managed to get the additional 2 pocket pieces out of this little bit of fabric here. So I'm quite happy with that. The main point that you need to consider with the lining pieces is that, again, the grain all needs to follow in the correct direction. So your grain lines that are on the fabric, there's one there, one there. Obviously that piece is on the fold. The grain line for that piece is just there, and obviously this piece here, which you can't see very well because I've had to turn it over upside down, is butted up to the selvage there. So as long as your grain lines are still in the correct order, it doesn't really matter if your lining pieces are going to be upside down, the print's upside down. I mean, obviously if that really bothers you, then, you know, buy some more fabric, or use a different lining. But for me, I'm really not bothered because it's going to be on the inside of my garment. So I'm going to go ahead and pin these pieces to this last remaining piece of fabric now, and then cut those out and make sure that they are noted that they're my lining pieces, because obviously I don't want to end up mistaking that for my outer fabric piece, so that it does end up where the print is upside down or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. One other thing that I wanted to show you, if you're making the sleeved version, what you need to consider as well is, obviously I've cut this piece out now, and I've cut where the notches are, the front and the back of the sleeve. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these points on the sleeve are going to be where you do your gathering stitches to gather the sleeve head so it fits into the bodice. Now, what I always do is this point here is going to be on the seam line of where your bodice front meets the bodice back, and I always, just for me, I always cut a little notch into that, obviously not through the seam line, but just a little notch there as well, so that when I put my gathering stitches in, I can see where the actual sleeve head is, and I make sure that that piece is positioned right on the seam line, so then I know it's central. So it's just an extra little tip there.